It was a warm Saturday morning in Birmingham, England, and the church bell rang softly as people filed into the pews, whispering among themselves, waiting for what many had already labeled the strangest wedding of the year. The bride was Grace Johnson, a 32-year-old black nanny who had spent years working in wealthy homes across the city, raising other people's children while carrying her own struggles quietly. She came from Atlanta, Georgia, where life had been tough, and moved to the UK to earn money for her family back home. Grace was known for her soft-spoken kindness and a smile that could light up any room, though behind it lay years of sacrifice and hardship. On this day, she stood in her nanny uniform, which doubled as her wedding dress because she couldn't afford anything else, and that alone had become a topic of mockery among the guests. The groom, Daniel Brooks, didn't help matters in the eyes of the crowd. He was tall with a rough beard, dressed in a worn-out suit that looked like it had been pulled from a thrift bin, shoes cracked at the sides, and an old faded tie that made him appear no better than a homeless man. He had no family present, no expensive ring, no flashy car outside waiting. He only had Grace. The guests filled the church with whispers and laughter, calling this union a mistake before it even began. Grace's closest friends, Melissa, Claire, and Janet, sat together and loudly whispered their disapproval, making sure others could hear. They called Daniel a beggar, mocked Grace for settling, and smirked at the very thought of this marriage. But despite the murmurs, despite the sideways glances, Grace's eyes never left Daniel's. She remembered the rainy night in Victoria Square when she first saw him sitting on the cold steps, ignored by everyone else, wrapped only in a thin blanket. She had given him food, stayed with him, listened to his stories, and discovered something no one else could see, a heart full of kindness, patience, and depth. She loved him for who he was, not for what he owned. Against everyone's advice, she chose him, and now she stood before the church, ready to promise forever. The ceremony began with Reverend Samuel Green asking if anyone had reason to object, and though the church fell silent, whispers and muffled laughter still lingered. Grace could feel the weight of judgment pressing against her, but she stood tall, gripping Daniel's rough hand. When it came time for vows, her voice trembled at first but grew steady, filled with conviction as she declared her love. She said, "Daniel, I don't care about where you come from, what you wear, or what people think. I choose you because of who you are, because of the way you care, the way you listen, and the way you make me feel safe. I love you with all that I am." A few guests rolled their eyes, others scoffed openly, and some smirked at her words, dismissing them as naive. Then Daniel, his voice deep yet gentle, spoke his vow. "Grace, you saw me when no one else did. You loved me when I had nothing. You are my blessing, and I promise to love you for the rest of my days." That simple statement made the room burst into cruel laughter. Some covered their mouths, others giggled, and even the groomsman, who had reluctantly stepped in as a witness, shook his head in disbelief. Melissa leaned toward Claire and whispered mockingly, "The rest of his days? He doesn't even have a house." The room echoed with mean-spirited amusement, but Daniel didn't falter. Instead, he raised his hand toward the pastor and asked for permission to speak further. The pastor, clearly uneasy, allowed him to approach the microphone. His shoes squeaked against the church floor, his old suit looked out of place, and the congregation braced themselves for what they assumed would be another moment of embarrassment. But when Daniel turned to face them, his voice came out calm yet commanding. He said, "I know what many of you are thinking. You laugh at my clothes, my shoes, and the way I look. You pity Grace, believing she has made the worst decision of her life. But let me tell you something. What you see is not who I am." Instantly, the laughter began to fade as curiosity filled the air. Daniel's eyes swept across the room as silence slowly replaced the mockery. He continued, I am not the man you think I am. I am not poor, I am not homeless, and I am not what these clothes suggest. My name is Daniel Brooks. I am the owner of Brooks Real Estate in London. I am a millionaire. Gasps echoed through the church. Melissa's jaw dropped, Claire's eyes widened, and Janet turned pale with shame. Daniel went on, I chose to live this way because I wanted to find out if there was anyone who could love me for me, not for my money. And Grace is that person. She saw me when no one else would look my way. She gave me food, spoke with me, and loved me without asking for anything. If you came here today to laugh, then I want you to understand, that the joke is not on us. It is on those who judge without knowing the truth. The entire congregation froze in stunned silence. The same guests who had smirked now looked down in guilt, their faces betraying their embarrassment. Grace's heart, however, pounded with conflicting emotions. Tears filled her eyes, not just from joy but from pain. She whispered under her breath, Why didn't you tell me? For while she was relieved to learn the truth, she also felt betrayed. She had married him believing he had nothing, loving him without condition. To discover that he had hidden such a life-altering truth shook her to her core. After the ceremony, as people who had mocked them now offered forced smiles and sudden respect, Grace pulled Daniel aside, her voice trembling with hurt. She asked, Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me stand there, humiliated, mocked, and judged? Daniel took her hand and pleaded, Grace, please, I needed to know. My whole life, women came after me only for money. I was trapped in shallow promises and empty relationships. I needed to know someone would love me for me, and then I found you. I had to be sure. Grace turned away, tears streaking her face. Love is not a game, Daniel. You should have trusted me from the beginning. And with that, she walked out of the church, leaving Daniel standing in the weight of his truth. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Grace retreated to her small flat in Birmingham, avoiding Daniel's calls and wrestling with her feelings. Part of her loved him still, but another part felt deeply betrayed. She replayed the wedding in her mind. The whispers, the laughter, the humiliation, followed by the sudden change in people's attitudes once Daniel revealed his wealth. It broke her heart that respect came not because of love, but because of money. Weeks passed before Daniel appeared at her doorstep, looking like a completely different man. He wore a neat tailored suit, his beard trimmed, shoes polished, and in his hands he carried a bouquet of flowers. But his eyes, soft, pleading, and filled with regret, spoke louder than his words. He said, Grace, I know I hurt you. I know I should have trusted you, but please believe me when I say everything I did came from fear. I've lost so much to people who only wanted my money. I was afraid, but you showed me a love I never thought I would find. Please forgive me. Grace stood quietly, tears welling in her eyes. She whispered, I never cared about your money, Daniel. I never did. All I wanted was honesty. I married you because I loved you as you were, and that was enough. Her words cut through him deeper than any judgment from strangers. He gently placed the flowers in her hands and said, Then let me make it right, not with money, but with love. Let me give you the wedding you deserve, not because I want to impress anyone, but because you are worth more than gold to me. His sincerity softened her anger, and though her heart was still bruised, a part of her wanted to believe him. Weeks later, Daniel proved his words true. He organized a wedding unlike anything Birmingham had ever seen, but it wasn't the wealth that made it remarkable. It was the intention behind every detail. The church, once filled with whispers of mockery, now bloomed with roses that filled the air with sweetness. Chandeliers sparkled from above, and every seat was filled with guests who had returned, this time not to laugh but to witness redemption. Grace walked down the aisle in a stunning white gown, the picture of elegance and grace. Daniel, in a fine tailored suit, stood tall with pride as he watched her. The air in the church felt entirely different from before. Where there had once been judgment and scorn, there was now silence and awe. Melissa, Claire, and Janet sat quietly, their heads bowed, humbled by the lessons they had learned. They no longer dared to whisper. As Grace reached the altar, her eyes locked with Daniel's, and in that moment every wound, every doubt, every betrayal seemed to melt into something deeper. The vows they spoke this time were not just words, but promises forged in fire. The congregation, many of whom had once mocked, now found themselves moved to tears. It wasn't the wealth or the grandeur that silenced them, but the undeniable truth that what they were witnessing was love, real, tested, and stronger than before. As the ceremony ended, Daniel turned to the guests and spoke once again, but this time with pride rather than defensiveness. He said, "This day is not just about us. It is about a lesson we should all remember. Never judge love by appearances. Never laugh at what you don't understand. True love is rare, and when you see it, respect it. Because in the end, it is not money or status that keeps a marriage alive. It is loyalty, kindness, and love." The church filled with thunderous applause, some guests even wiping away tears. Grace, standing by his side, smiled through her own tear. She had forgiven him, and together they knew their story had become something greater than themselves. A living reminder that appearances deceive, but love reveals truth. Their journey spread quickly beyond Birmingham. Parents retold the story to children as a lesson about compassion. Churches used it in sermons about humility and faith. Couples found strength in it, realizing that real relationships are built not on wealth or status, but on honesty and devotion. Grace, once mocked for being a nanny in a uniform, became celebrated for showing the world that true love is blind to appearances. Over time, the story of Grace and Daniel spread far and wide, carried through whispers, conversations, and social media. People everywhere found themselves inspired by the nanny who loved a man she believed was homeless, only to discover he was a millionaire. Some saw it as a fairy tale, while others saw it as a cautionary tale about honesty. But at its heart, it was a story about resilience, forgiveness, and the power of seeing beyond the surface. In the quiet moments of their home, when all the noise faded away, Grace and Daniel often sat together, hand in hand, reflecting on everything they had endured. The journey had been messy, painful, and uncertain, yet it had shaped them into something stronger. Grace no longer walked in the shadow of judgment, but in the light of respect, and Daniel no longer lived in fear of being loved only for his wealth. Together, they proved that true love survives not because it is easy, but because it is chosen again and again, even when tested by fire. Their story became a beacon to others searching for hope, reminding the world that the greatest riches are not found in money, but in the loyalty of a faithful heart. And so, what began with whispers of laughter ended with echoes of admiration. What began with judgment ended with respect. Grace and Daniel's love became proof that appearances can deceive, wealth can change perceptions, but the heart never lies. Their story was not just about a nanny and a millionaire. It was about every person who has ever been mocked for loving someone different, every soul who has ever been judged without being known, and every couple who has ever faced doubt from the outside world yet stood strong together. Grace and Daniel showed us that true love is about seeing someone's heart and choosing them, not once, but every day, no matter what the world says. And as their story spread across cities and nations, touching hearts everywhere, it left a powerful message. Never underestimate the power of love, and never judge what you don't understand. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more powerful tales like this one. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and hit the like button to help us reach more people who need stories of hope and inspiration. Thank you for listening, and remember, real love, the kind that lasts, is worth more than all the gold in the world.